The Kalen Drift was not a place where things happened. It was a wide and empty stretch of space between two dead star systems, full of old dust and cold rock and very little else. Vorith patrol ships passed through it every few months, logged nothing new, and moved on. It was the kind of place that made a scout feel like the universe had forgotten to put anything interesting there. Orvin had done 6 rotations through the drift over his career. He had logged dust clouds, a few tumbling rocks, and one comet that turned out to already be catalogued. He was not expecting anything different this time. His sensor officer, Pren, found the contact 40 minutes into their sweep. "Something is out there," Pren said, and his voice had a careful quality to it, the kind a person used when they were not sure what they were looking at and did not want to say the wrong thing. Orvin crossed to the sensor station and looked at the display. The contact was large. Larger than most Vorith cruisers. It was sitting still in the dark between the two dead systems, and it was not putting out any signal that would tell the universe it was there. No engine output. No broadcast. No beacon. Just a shape, sitting in the cold, like something that had been placed there very deliberately and had no intention of announcing itself. "Run the shape through the database," Orvin said. Pren ran it. The database came back with nothing. Not an approximate match, not a partial result. Nothing. Whatever this object was, no Vorith record had ever seen anything like it. Orvin ordered a quiet approach. He brought his 3 patrol ships in from different angles, which was what doctrine called for when dealing with an unknown contact. The idea was that if the object turned hostile, at least one ship would survive to carry the report home. He did not say this out loud to his crew, but everyone on the patrol knew the reasoning. As they got closer, the shape on the sensor display became a shape that meant something. It was a ship. A very large ship. The hull was painted a dark gray-green, the color of deep water on a heavy planet. The plating along its sides was thick. Pren had to run a second scan to confirm it was surface plating and not the actual hull beneath, because the armor was so dense it read like structural material. The ship had no soft curves, no decorative lines, no design choices that suggested anyone had built it to look impressive. Every surface on it existed for a reason. It looked like something that had been made entirely to work and not at all to be admired. "Weapons," Pren said, in the same careful voice. "Many of them. The forward section alone has more emitter structures than I can quickly classify. The side arrays are large. I am generating new file entries for several of the weapon types because I do not have existing categories for them." Orvin looked at the display without speaking. He counted the visible barrel structures along the ship's forward edge. He stopped counting at 30 and decided the number was not the important thing. He ordered the standard first contact broadcast. It went out on 17 frequencies, including the 2 that Vorith diplomatic training called universal. Then he waited. 11 minutes passed. Nothing moved. Nothing responded. Then the ship's exterior lights came on. Not all at once. A row of pale lights along the main spine came on first, steady and quiet. Then a second row along the lower hull. Then, very slowly, the forward sensor array on the vessel began to rotate, a wide, unhurried sweep of the surrounding space, as if something inside the ship had woken up and was taking its time to look around and see who was there. "Engines are warming," Pren said. "The power output is building. The drive signature does not match any known engine type. I am creating a new file category for it." Orvin noticed that Pren had now created 2 new file categories in less than 10 minutes. He did not say anything about that either. A response came back. It arrived on all 17 frequencies simultaneously, which was not something a civilization did by accident. The voice that came through was smooth and low, clearly from a species with a single fixed mouth, and the language was completely unknown. The translation system worked on it slowly, matching rhythm and structure against known linguistic databases, building meaning one phrase at a time. What came back was this: the ship was a warship. The species that built it called themselves humans. The ship had been running quiet during a crew rotation. The humans had detected the approach of the Vorith patrol 11 minutes before Orvin sent his broadcast. They had been watching. And they had been waiting to see what the Vorith would do first. Orvin read that translation 3 times. Then he sent back a diplomatic greeting, gave his name and rank, identified the patrol wing, and asked the standard questions. Origin point. Destination. Whether the vessel needed any assistance. The reply came with a short delay. The human voice said they did not need assistance. It gave an origin point, a set of coordinates that Pren put into the navigation system immediately, and which pointed to a region of space well beyond the current edge of any Vorith map, in a direction no Vorith explorer had gone. For destination, the voice said the ship was on patrol. It was surveying the border of what the humans considered their territory. Orvin looked at his display. The Kalen Drift had been mapped by Vorith ships for 3 generations. It sat well inside what every Vorith record called Vorith space. It was not a border zone. It was not a frontier. It was interior territory, unremarkable and well established. He asked, very carefully, what the humans considered the border of their territory to be. The voice gave coordinates. Pren plotted them without being asked, and the resulting line appeared across the navigation display. The Kalen Drift sat 22 light-years inside it. No one on the patrol said anything. The 3 ships held their positions. Orvin looked at the line on the map. Then he looked at the dark, waiting vessel outside his viewport. The ship had not moved since the lights came on. It was just sitting there, patient and very large, with that slow sensor sweep still rotating across its forward section. Pren pulled up the full armor analysis and added it to the report file. The plating figures were not comfortable numbers. He added the engine data. He added the weapons count. He added a note about the new file categories and what had caused him to create them. Then he flagged the file as priority critical. He started to write, recommend review by the War Council, at the top and then stopped. He sat with it for a moment. Then he deleted War Council and wrote, recommend immediate review by all available command personnel, and did not change it again. Orvin keyed his long-range communication channel and began composing his report to command. He had written many reports in 30 years of patrol work. He knew how to be clear and how to be brief and how to give commanders the facts without the feelings. He wrote for a long time on this one. Outside the viewport, the Cradle of Ruin, that was the name Pren had eventually pulled from the hull markings, translated slowly and imperfectly, sat in the dark of the drift with its lights on and its engines at low power, waiting with the particular patience of something that was very sure it did not need to hurry. Orvin finished his report. He read it back once. He sent it. Then he sat in his chair and looked at the shape on his sensor display and thought about the line on the navigation map, and the 11 minutes, and the 17 frequencies, and the phrase that kept coming back through the translation, standard patrol. The humans had called this a standard patrol. He decided he needed more time to think about what that meant. He suspected the War Council would feel the same way. Fleet Commander Sava had read Orvin's report 4 times before her ship finished its transit to the Kalen Drift. She had also read the sensor data that Pren had attached. She had read the weapon count. She had read the armor figures and the engine analysis and the notes about new file categories. She had read the part about the 17 frequencies and the 11 minutes and the translated name on the hull. She had read all of it carefully, the way she read everything, without letting herself react until she had gone through it completely. By the 4th read, she had stopped reacting and started thinking, which was where she needed to be. She had brought everything available. 6 cruisers. 2 carrier platforms. A dedicated electronic warfare ship whose whole purpose was to disrupt enemy sensors and cut off communication. By any Vorith standard, this was a force that ended problems before they started. This was the kind of formation that other fleets looked at and decided there was nothing worth fighting over. She had done this before, 3 times in her career, and each time it had worked the way it was supposed to. The Cradle of Ruin was still in the same position when the formation arrived. It had not moved. It had not sent any further signals after Orvin's patrol wing logged the first contact and pulled back to safe distance. It was sitting exactly where it had been, lights on along its spine, that slow sensor sweep still moving, engines at low idle. The way it held its position reminded Sava of someone standing in a doorway with their arms at their sides, not aggressive, not retreating, simply present and entirely comfortable. She studied it from the command deck of her flagship, the Measured Tide, for several minutes before doing anything else. One of Orvin's junior officers, a young man named Seth, had added a personal note at the bottom of the patrol report. Sava had almost skipped it, because personal notes from junior officers were usually not the most important part of a report. She was glad she had not skipped it. Seth had written, when we approached, the vessel did not power its weapons. It powered its lights. Sava had spent 30 years in the Vorith fleet. She had been in standoffs and border responses and 2 conflicts that the government still officially called enforcement actions. She knew the sequence of things a ship did when it was getting ready for a fight. She knew what power shifts looked like and what they meant. What Seth had described was not that sequence. She ordered the diplomatic hail. All frequencies, with the translation system running in parallel rather than in sequence, working from the partial linguistic profile Pren had built. The response came in 4 minutes. A human, identifying himself as Cole, the ship's communication officer. He expressed no alarm at the arrival of a Vorith fleet formation. He expressed no concern at all, in fact. He spoke the way someone spoke when they had been expecting a call and were pleased that it had finally come. Cole asked if the Vorith commander wished to conduct formal introductions. Sava said yes. What followed was 90 minutes of careful, structured conversation. Cole was replaced partway through by a woman named Lena, who identified herself as the ship's diplomatic liaison. Lena spoke slowly and paused often to make sure the translation was keeping up. She was very good at this. She never said anything that sounded like a threat, and she never said anything that suggested the humans were uncertain about where they stood or what they were doing there. At some point during the conversation, Sava's sensor officer Dorith broke into the command channel. His voice was quiet in a way that meant he was not sure how to say what he was about to say. He had been running continuous scans of the Cradle of Ruin during the entire diplomatic exchange. He had picked up a faint energy reading earlier and set it aside as background noise. He had kept looking at it because it was almost too consistent to be natural. He had spent the last hour isolating it. There were 2 more ships in the drift. They were not visible. They were running with almost all active systems suppressed, their output reduced so completely that Dorothy's sensors had read them as part of the background radiation. They were holding position approximately 40,000 kilometers off the flanks of the Cradle of Ruin, 1 to port, 1 to starboard. They had been there the whole time. From before Orvan's patrol had arrived. Through the long silence. Through the diplomatic exchange. Through the arrival of 6 Vorith cruisers and 2 carrier platforms. They had not moved. They had not powered up. They had simply held their positions in the dark and waited, invisible, for whatever their captain decided to do. Sava pulled up the readings herself. She looked at them for a long time. Then she looked up at the Cradle of Ruin on the main display, sitting there patient and quiet with its slow sensor sweep going and its lights on, and she understood that the ship had known exactly where her cruisers were from the moment they dropped out of transit. It had known, and it had continued its diplomatic conversation, and it had not done anything about it, because it did not need to. She asked Lena, very carefully, how many ships were in the human formation. Lena answered without any pause at all. 3 vessels, the Cradle of Ruin, and 2 escort-class frigates running in low-emission mode. She said that low-emission posture during first contact scenarios was standard procedure. She gave the exact positions of both frigates, which matched Dorothy's readings precisely. She said she hoped the quiet presence of the escorts had not caused any confusion, and she said it the way someone said something when they were being polite rather than apologetic. Sava told her there was no confusion. She asked Dorith, quietly and off the main channel, what he thought the frigates could do if they decided to move. Dorith said he had been trying to work that out and that he did not yet have a good answer, because the power signatures were suppressed too far for detailed analysis. What he could say was that both ships were larger than they had initially appeared, that their whole geometry matched what little information existed in the database about fast intercept designs, and that whatever they were capable of, they were clearly capable of hiding it completely when they wanted to. Sava absorbed this. Then she went back to the diplomatic channel and told Lena that the Vorith would be open to discussing the question of territorial boundaries, and asked whether the humans would be willing to participate in a joint survey of the drift as a starting point. Lena said she needed to confirm with her captain but expected no difficulty. The confirmation came back in 3 minutes. Sava spent those 3 minutes sitting very still and going through what she had seen and heard since the fleet arrived. She had come here with 6 cruisers, 2 carriers, and a purpose-built jamming ship, and the humans had watched them arrive, identified every vessel, continued a polite conversation, and confirmed a joint survey proposal, all without once giving any indication that the formation surrounding them represented a serious concern. She was a fleet commander with 30 years of experience. She had seen many things in that time. She had been surprised before. She had been in situations where she did not immediately have an advantage, and she had learned to manage them. This felt different. She opened her report to command and added a new section below the initial contact summary. She wrote it plainly, without softening the language, because she did not think softening it would serve anyone well. She wrote that the humans had been watching before they were noticed, that their escort ships had remained undetected through the full initial contact sequence, and that in her assessment, the formation's arrival with 6 cruisers had not altered the strategic situation in any meaningful way. She paused before writing the last line. Then she wrote it anyway. The humans did not react to our fleet as a threat. They reacted to it as a development worth noting. She flagged the section and sent the report. Outside the viewport, the Kalen drift was quiet. The cradle of ruin held its position in the dark, and somewhere 40,000 kilometers off its flanks, two ships that most sensors would never have found waited in the cold, patient and invisible, for whatever came next. The joint survey had been running for 2 days when everything changed. The work itself had been careful and slow and entirely without drama. Vorith survey ships moved through their assigned sectors of the drift while human technical staff on the cradle of ruin shared navigational data over the agreed communication channel. Lena was present for most of it, managing the flow of information with the same patient competence she had shown since the beginning. Her counterpart on the Vorith side was a mapping officer named Seth, who had been Orvan's junior officer during the first contact and had since been reassigned to Sava's staff because his notes had shown good judgment. Seth found the debris field first, though only by a matter of seconds. It was at the outer edge of the mapping zone, a cluster of metallic shapes that his sensor array flagged as unusual because the spacing was too regular to be natural. Debris from collisions or explosions spread in arcs and fans. This was arranged differently. His flag went up at almost the exact same moment as a similar alert from the Cradle of Ruin, which told him that human sensors were working at least as well as his and possibly faster in certain frequency ranges. Sava brought the measured tide in close enough for a full scan. The metallic shapes were what was left of a Vorith freighter. The name on the hull, still partly readable through the damage, was a civilian cargo vessel that had been listed as missing for 11 months. The official fleet record said it had likely been lost to gravitational turbulence in a different sector entirely, 2 systems away from the drift. Everyone who had filed paperwork on it had assumed it was gone to bad luck and bad navigation. The damage on the hull told a different story. Sava's tactical officer, Owen, spent several minutes going over the strike patterns without saying anything. Then he said that the damage was consistent with weapon types used by a raider faction the Vorith had been trying to contain for 3 years. The patterns matched documented attacks on 5 other vessels over the past 18 months. The Kalen Drift, apparently, had become a route the raiders were using to move through the region without being tracked. The freighter had come through at the wrong time and found them. Sava ordered a recovery team to begin working on the wreck. She started composing an alert to the nearest Vorith response base, already calculating that the base was 6 hours away at maximum transit speed and that any raiders still in the area would be long gone before a response force could arrive. She had not yet finished the alert when the human captain spoke. His name was Aaron. He had been quiet through most of the joint survey, letting Lena manage the day-to-day communication. His voice on the channel was calm and even, without hurry, and he asked a simple question: would the Vorith be willing to accept joint assistance in what he called a pursuit and recovery action? Sava asked what he meant by that. Aaron said that the Cradle of Ruin's passive sensor systems had been tracking a group of vessels moving away from the freighter's position. He said he had assumed at first that they were Vorith support ships and had not flagged them. He had realized in the past hour that they were not. He had a course heading. He had an estimated current position, extrapolated from the movement data his systems had been quietly collecting. He had, it became clear as he spoke, been watching those ships for more than 24 hours without mentioning it, waiting to understand what they were before saying anything. He asked, with the same level voice he had used from the start, whether the Vorith would like him to do something about it. Sava looked at Owen. Owen ran the calculation without being asked. The raiders had too much of a lead. The nearest Vorith response force was the 6-hour base, and given the heading Aaron had just provided, the raider group would be out of the drift and into unmapped space in less than 3 hours. She asked Aaron how long it would take the Cradle of Ruin to reach intercept range at best speed. There was a pause. Not a long one. Aaron said they were already there. The Cradle of Ruin was gone from its survey position before Sava had finished processing what he had said. One moment it was holding station off the port side of the measured tide. The next moment the space it had been occupying was empty, and Dorith was reporting a drive signature that had spiked so fast and so hard that his instruments were still catching up with what they had recorded. The 2 frigates moved with it. They went from their quiet holding positions to full intercept vectors in a transition that Owen described as instantaneous and then corrected himself and said that was not quite right, but the acceleration curve was so far outside the Vorith database that he did not have better language for it. All 3 human ships were gone into the dark. Sava ordered the Vorith formation to follow at best speed, knowing they would not close the distance, knowing that whatever happened out there would be over before her ships arrived. Owen pulled up the tactical projection and began trying to model what 3 human vessels could do against an unknown number of raiders. He stopped modeling when the first transmission came back. Aaron's voice, as steady as it had been at the survey site, came over the shared channel. He reported that the raider formation had consisted of 9 vessels. He gave the approximate class and armament of each one. This told Sava, without him saying so, that the Cradle of Ruin's passive sensors had been doing very detailed work on those ships during the 24 hours he had been watching them. He reported that the raiders had attempted to scatter when the human ships closed to engagement range, spreading in multiple directions simultaneously, which was the standard tactic for a group trying to force a pursuing force to split its attention and let some escape. He reported that the frigates had handled the scatter pattern. He reported that the action was complete. Sava looked at the time stamp on the transmission. Then she looked at the time stamp on the moment the Cradle of Ruin had left its survey position. She asked Owen to confirm the elapsed time between those 2 points. Owen ran the numbers. He checked them. He ran them again. 16 minutes. He looked up at her with an expression she had never seen on him in 9 years of working together. He said, "Commander. They did not lose a ship." She already knew. She asked him to confirm the raider count anyway, because she wanted to hear him say the full result out loud. 9 vessels, Owen said. None escaped. No reported Vorith casualties from the freighter incident have changed. No human casualties. No human vessels reported damaged. 3 ships. 9 raiders. 16 minutes. Nobody hurt on either side except the raiders. The Cradle of Ruin was already on its return heading to the survey site. Aaron came back on the channel with a follow-up. He said the wreck of the Vorith freighter had been examined by the frigates during the approach and that 3 of the original 14 crew members had survived. They had been sealed in an emergency stasis compartment that had kept them alive through 11 months of cold and darkness. He asked whether the Vorith had medical facilities available for the survivors or whether the humans should provide care in the meantime. Sava said the Measured Tide had a full medical bay and a medical team standing by. Aaron said the survivors would be ready for transfer within the hour. He thanked her for the cooperative survey. She thanked him in return. Her voice was steady. She was a fleet commander and she knew how to keep her voice steady. She closed the channel and turned to her command deck. Owen was staring at the time stamps on his display. Dorothy was looking at the sensor record of the departure, the moment the 3 human ships had gone from stationary to full speed, and running it back and forth as if watching it again might help him understand it. Sava thought about the 9 raiders. Vorith doctrine called for a minimum of 12 warships to engage that faction with acceptable risk margins. She had brought 6 cruisers and 2 carriers to this contact and felt confident doing so. The humans had sent 3 ships and finished the job in the time it would have taken a Vorith response force to receive the alert and begin organizing. She sat down in the command chair, which she did not often do during active situations. She thought about the lights coming on instead of weapons. She thought about the frigates holding invisible for days. She thought about Aaron's voice saying we are already there, and the way the 3 ships had moved, and the 16 minutes, and the calm follow-up asking about the medical bay. She thought about all of it for a while. Then she opened her report file and started writing a section that she already knew was going to change a great many things back home. The Vorith War Council met in a closed session that lasted 6 hours, and nobody left feeling comfortable. That was not unusual, exactly. The War Council dealt with difficult things by profession, and its members were not people who expected comfort from their work. But there was a specific kind of discomfort that came from looking at a problem and realizing that the tools you had always used to understand problems no longer quite fit, and that was what settled over the chamber as the session went on. Council Senior Vreth opened with the sensor data. She put it on the main display and went through it section by section, slowly and without editorializing, because the data said everything that needed to be said without her help. She showed the armor readings. She showed the weapons count. She showed the engine signature that Pren had flagged with a new file category because no existing category covered it. She showed the speed data from the departure sequence, the moment the Cradle of Ruin had gone from stationary to full intercept velocity and what that curve looked like when graphed against every known drive type in the Vorith database. The graph was not a comfortable thing to look at. Then she showed the frigates. She spent more time on this than on anything else, because she thought it was the most important part and she was not sure the Council fully understood why yet. The 2 escort ships had been within sensor range of the Vorith patrol from the very beginning. They had been there when Orvin arrived with his 3 patrol ships. They had been there through 11 minutes of silence. They had been there through the full first diplomatic exchange. They had been there when Sava arrived with 6 cruisers and 2 carrier platforms. They had been invisible the entire time. Not because of any stealth equipment the Vorith could identify. Both Pren and Dorith had looked specifically for known stealth technologies and found nothing. They had been invisible because the crew of those ships had suppressed their output so precisely and so completely that military-grade sensors had read them as background noise. That was not a technology achievement. That was training. That was a crew that knew exactly what their ship was capable of and had made a deliberate choice, in the middle of a first contact situation with an unknown alien fleet, to stay quiet and let their captain decide what was needed. Vreth let the council sit with that for a moment. Then she moved to the engagement record. The Raider faction that the Cradle of Ruin had destroyed in 16 minutes had been classified by Vorith intelligence as a mid-level threat. Not the most dangerous group operating in the region, but capable enough that Doctrine called for a minimum response force of 12 Vorith warships to engage them with acceptable risk. That figure was not conservative. It was based on 3 years of collected engagement data and calculated to leave enough margin that the Vorith would not lose ships they could not afford to lose. 3 human ships had handled 9 of those raiders in 16 minutes without losing a vessel or reporting a single casualty. A retired fleet officer named Sen asked how the humans had managed the scatter pattern. That was always the problem with raider engagements. When a formation broke apart and ran in multiple directions at once, a pursuit force had to either split its strength and risk each smaller group being overwhelmed, or let some escape. There was no clean solution. It was a problem that Vorith tacticians had been working around rather than solving for a long time. Vreth showed him the frigate tracking data. The 2 frigates had split the moment the raiders began their scatter. They had gone in opposite directions simultaneously, cutting off the outward vectors while the Cradle of Ruin held the center of the formation and prevented the core from breaking through. The timing between the 3 ships was so precise that Dorith had initially believed it was automated, that some coordinated software system was directing the movements rather than individual crew decisions being made in real time. His final analysis had concluded it was not automated. It was the result of crews that had trained together long enough to respond as a single unit without needing to communicate during the action itself. Sen asked no further questions. The council moved to what Vreth considered the harder subject. Not the capability data, which was simply what it was, but what the existence of that capability, present, patrolling, and apparently long established, said about everything the Vorith thought they knew about the space around them. The Kalen Drift was interior Vorith territory. It had been interior territory for 3 generations. If the humans considered it within normal patrol range, then the space between the drift and wherever humans actually lived was space the Vorith had never looked at carefully. Every system the Vorith thought of as their frontier might be, from the human perspective, somewhere in the middle. Every exploration mission the Vorith had dispatched toward unmapped space over the past several decades might have been moving deeper into a region that someone else already knew well. No one on the council said that out loud. But everyone was thinking it, and Vreth could see it on their faces. The vote to open formal diplomatic talks was not close. It passed quickly, with the kind of unanimity that came not from agreement but from the shared understanding that there was no reasonable alternative. What took longer was the secondary discussion that Vreth pushed for in the final hour, after the diplomatic track was settled. She called it a doctrine review. The other members used quieter language for it, words that meant they had been wrong about things they had been confident about for a long time, and that they needed to say so clearly before they could fix anything. Vorith First Contact Doctrine assumed that a newly encountered species would show you what they had. That was what the Vorith did. That was what every species they had encountered over the past 2 centuries had done. You arrived with your best ships. You let the other side see your strength. You built the negotiating position through presence and display. The underlying assumption was that the relationship between what a species showed and what a species had was roughly direct. The humans had done the opposite of this. They had shown less than they were at every stage. They had sat in the dark and said nothing until someone else made a move. They had brought escort ships and kept them invisible. They had held their engine capability in reserve through the entire first contact sequence and revealed it only when there was a specific reason to use it. At no point had they displayed their full capability. At no point had they needed to. The assumption that first contact posture reflected a species' actual strength needed to be removed from the training doctrine. That was the first conclusion of the review. Vreth wrote it herself and she did not soften it. The second conclusion was harder to write because it was less tactical and more honest. It concerned the 6 cruisers and 2 carriers that Sava had brought to the drift. Bringing overwhelming force to a first contact situation was standard doctrine because it established leverage before any negotiation began. You arrived with power, you showed it, and the other side understood where they stood. Sava had arrived with overwhelming force. The humans had noticed it, confirmed it, and continued their diplomatic conversation without adjusting their posture in any way. They had not been impressed. They had not been intimidated. They had simply filed the information away and kept doing what they had been doing before Sava arrived. The second conclusion read, "Force that does not change the behavior of the other party is not leverage. It is a statement about what you believe. If the other party does not share that belief, it communicates nothing except your own assumptions." This conclusion required 3 drafts before the council was willing to adopt it, not because it was wrong but because it was uncomfortable. It meant that 30 years of Vorith strategic doctrine had been built on an assumption that happened to have always been true before, and that the assumption was now demonstrably not universal. A junior analyst who had read all of the field reports in sequence was brought in during the final hour to summarize her findings for the council. Her name was Mara, and she was young enough that she had not been in the fleet long enough to have strong feelings about the doctrine she was being asked to critique. She gave her summary clearly and briefly. She said the thing that stood out to her most, across everything that had happened from Orvan's first contact through the engagement and recovery action, was a pattern of restraint. At every point where the humans could have shown more than they chose to show, they had shown less. At every point where they could have acted without waiting, they had waited. At every point where an aggressive response was available to them, they had responded with something quieter instead. She said she thought the doctrine review needed to account for the possibility that they had encountered a species that was very powerful and knew it, and that chose to behave the way they did not because of limitation but because of preference. The council chamber was quiet after she finished. Vreth thanked her and noted her summary in the record. Then she closed the session and told the members the written doctrine document would be circulated within the week. She stayed in the chamber after the others left and sat for a while with the sensor images of the cradle of ruin on the display in front of her, that dark gray-green hull, those pale lights along the spine, the slow patient turn of the forward sensor array. The ship that had sat in the drift doing nothing threatening and been more unsettling for it than any armed aggressor she had encountered in her career. She thought about Mara's word. Preference. She thought that was probably the right word. And she thought that what you did with a powerful species that chose patience over pressure, and restraint over demonstration, was something the doctrine manual was going to need a great deal of new language to address. She started writing. The formal talks were held on a Vorith station at the edge of the Kalen Drift. Vreth had suggested neutral ground and the humans had agreed without argument, which was itself a small thing that Sava noted in the margin of her preparation file. When a party agrees to your proposed location without negotiating for something more favorable, it either means they do not care where the conversation happens, or it means every location is already acceptable to them. Neither reading was entirely comfortable. The human delegation arrived on a vessel that was not the Cradle of Ruin. It was smaller, clean-lined, with no external weapon systems visible and no armor plating that stood out. It docked at the station with quiet efficiency, and the 4 people who came aboard through the docking corridor walked into the meeting room and sat down without ceremony. Their lead negotiator was a man named Garrett. He was older, with the kind of unhurried manner that came from having done this many times and stopped worrying about whether it would work out. He shook hands with Vreth and with Sava and with the 2 council members who had come in person, and then he sat down and asked, before anyone else could speak, what the Vorith side needed to know in order to feel that the conversation could go somewhere useful. That question disrupted 3 people who had prepared opening statements. Sava watched it happen and made a note. Garrett was accompanied by a legal specialist named Dana, who was quiet and precise and had a way of inserting a single clarifying sentence into a complicated discussion that reframed everything that had been said before it. She also had a technical liaison named Owen, a younger man, no relation to Sava's tactical officer, who drew diagrams on a handheld surface when words got complicated, and who seemed genuinely pleased when a Vorith technical officer leaned over to look at one of his drawings more closely. The 4th member of the human delegation was a young woman named Becca who said very little and took notes at a speed that suggested she was capturing everything for people who were not in the room. The talks lasted 4 days. What they produced was not a treaty. Garrett said on the first day that a treaty was too large a thing to build from a starting point of this little shared history, and that starting with something smaller and getting it right would serve both sides better than rushing towards something that looked complete. Vreth agreed with this, though she noted later that Garrett had said it first and she had agreed, which was a small thing but the kind of small thing that told you something about how a negotiation was going. The framework they produced covered 3 areas. The first was contact protocols, agreed procedures for how ships from each side would identify themselves and communicate when they encountered each other unexpectedly, to prevent the kind of extended silence and uncertainty that had marked Orvan's first contact. The second was navigational data sharing for the drift and surrounding sectors, so that both sides would have a clearer picture of what was in the region they were both moving through. The third was a joint process for situations like the Raider incident, so that if something like that happened again, neither side would need to improvise a response in real time. The third area took the longest to work out because it required both sides to be honest about what they could and could not do, which was not something either side had been doing openly before the talks. The Vorith were careful about revealing capability figures. The humans were also careful, but in a different way. They were careful about not making the Vorith feel they were being asked to accept a partner whose strength made the arrangement unequal. Garrett handled this by always framing human capability in terms of what it meant for the shared work rather than what it said about the humans themselves, and Dana would add the precise language that kept that framing in the written record. On the third day, Sava had a separate conversation with Lena, who had come as part of the extended delegation rather than the core negotiating team. They sat in one of the station's smaller rooms with a shared translation interface between them and talked for 2 hours about things that were not on the formal agenda. Lena was direct in a way that was not rude. She said that the humans had been aware of the Vorith for longer than the Vorith had been aware of them, which Sava had suspected but not confirmed. She said the human fleet had debated for some time about whether and how to make contact, and that the decision to hold a patrol in the drift had been partly a choice to be present in a place where being found was possible. They had not hidden their ship in a way that would have been truly undetectable. They had simply not announced themselves, and waited to see who came and what they did. Sava asked why. Lena said that what a species did when they first found something they did not expect told you a great deal about them. She said the humans had found the information from that first encounter very useful. Sava asked what information. Lena said, "You brought a diplomatic hail before you brought weapons. So did your fleet commander. Your junior officer wrote a note about the lights instead of the guns. Those are the things we remember." Sava thought about Seth, who had filed a personal note in the bottom of a patrol report that he probably assumed no one important would read. She thought about the lights on the spine of the cradle of ruin, coming on one row at a time in the dark. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she asked if the frigates had always been there, or if they had been moved into position after the patrol was detected. Lena smiled, which the translation system rendered as an expression indicating warm honesty, and said they had always been there. Sava nodded. She had thought so. On the last day of the talks, Vreth made a request that she had been considering since the doctrine review session back home. She asked for a direct communication channel between the Vorith War Council and whoever commanded human fleet operations in the region. Not a general diplomatic line. A direct line, named, with a specific person on the other end who would respond. Garrett agreed immediately and without conditions, which was the kind of agreement that told you a great deal about how seriously the other party was taking the relationship they were building. The answer to Vreth's channel request came the next morning. The name of the regional human fleet commander was Admiral Nora Caldwell. Her listed title was Regional Defense Coordinator, and below her name was a note saying she was available for direct contact at any time and would respond within one Vorith day cycle. Vreth read the title twice. Defense Coordinator. Not Fleet Commander, not Territorial Authority, not any of the titles the Vorith used for the people who ran the ships that protected their space. Defense Coordinator was a title that said something about how the humans thought about what their fleet was for. She added it to the file she had been building since Orvan's first report. The lights before the weapons. The frigates holding still. Aaron asking about the medical bay. Garrett asking what the Vorith needed before he said what the humans wanted. Lena saying they remembered the diplomatic hail. And now this title, written plainly at the top of a contact record, in a language that required no translation. The doctrine review document was finished and distributed 2 weeks after the talks ended. It went to every level of the Vorith fleet, down to patrol wing commanders. Orvan received his copy on a transit back to the Kalen Drift, where he had been reassigned to lead the joint navigational survey that the framework had established. He read the full document during a long shift while the stars moved past his viewport. He read the new contact protocols and the updated sensor standards and the revised engagement models. He read the section Sava had contributed on capability assessment, which was longer and more honest than anything he had seen in a doctrine document before. He read Vreth's final section last. It was the shortest part of the document. It was titled something that translated as First Contact Principles, and it had clearly been written by someone who had scrapped longer drafts before arriving at this one. It said, "A species that chooses to show you patience before power is telling you something important about what they value. Listen before you decide what they are." Below that, there was one more line. It was not marked as doctrine and it did not have a classification heading. It was simply there, at the end, in plain language. It said, "They were not trying to frighten us. They were waiting to see if we were worth talking to. We should think carefully about what we do with that." Orvin read it twice. Then he put the reader down on his bunk and looked out at the stars for a long time. He thought about the cradle of ruin sitting in the dark with its lights on. He thought about the 11 minutes of silence and the 17 frequencies and the slow turn of the sensor array. He thought about a ship that could cross-intercept distance in the time it took to have a short conversation, and that had chosen to have the conversation instead. He thought about what Vreth had written. Worth talking to. He picked up the reader again and opened a new file. He started writing a note to Sava. He told her he had read the full document and he had a question he wanted her opinion on. He wanted to know what she thought came next, now that they were past the part where neither side knew the other existed. Her reply came before his next shift started. It was 3 sentences. She said she did not know exactly what came next, because the maps they had always used did not cover the territory they were standing in now. She said she thought that was probably not a bad thing. She said she believed the humans knew the way, and that following someone who had been patient enough to wait and see if you were worth the conversation was, in her experience, a reasonable place to start. Orvin read it. He set the reader down again. Outside the viewport, the Kalen drift was quiet and wide and full of dark space that both sides were only beginning to map together. It did not feel as empty as it used to.